You are 20 years old, kneeling in the mud of your family's rice paddy in a small village outside Kagoshima when the red envelope arrives. It is the spring of 1943. Your mother sees the postman's bicycle first. She stops singing before he even reaches the gate. In your village, everyone knows what a red envelope means. Your father was too old for the last war and too proud to say he is relieved. Your younger brother Kenji, only 14, runs to grab the envelope before anyone can stop him, as if delaying it by 10 seconds might change what's written inside. It does not. You have ordinary plans. Finish repairing the roof before the rains come. Marry Aiko once the harvest is in. Take over the paddy from your father, the way his father passed it to him, nothing heroic, nothing complicated. Music, the notice gives you 7 days. Your mother sews through the night, kneeling with the neighbor women around a length of white cloth stretched across the table. Each woman adds 1 red stitch, a senninbari, a 1,000-stitch belt, 1 knot from 1,000 different hands meant to turn away bullets. You watch the belt grow, stitch by stitch. And you do not tell your mother that you do not believe in it. You wear it anyway, under your shirt, because refusing would break something in her that the army has not yet touched. On your last evening, Aiko walks with you along the river path where you used to fish as children. She presses a small folded paper crane into your palm and closes your fingers around it. "Fly home," she says. And neither of you says the word that means the crane might instead be all that comes back. You put it inside your cap against your scalp, where it will stay through training, across the sea, into the jungle, and onto islands whose names you have never heard. The army sends you to a training camp in Kyushu. They shave your head, burn your civilian clothes, and give you a number stitched into your collar where your name used to be. An older soldier named Corporal Ishii strikes you across the face for looking at the ground during roll call. He strikes the man beside you for looking up. You learn quickly that there is no correct way to stand, only degrees of being wrong. Obedience, not survival, is the first lesson. Survival comes later, if it comes at all. Music, you bayonet straw dummies until your arms shake. You are taught that surrender is a stain no water can wash from a family's name, that a soldier's death in service to the emperor is lighter than a feather, while his life is heavier than a mountain. You recite it so many times the words stop meaning anything, the way a word said aloud 100 times stops sounding like a word. That is where you meet Tomo, a fisherman's son from Shikoku, who can name every fish in the sea, but has never held a rifle before this month. He keeps a small wooden comb his sister carved for him, and he runs his thumb along its teeth whenever an officer's voice rises. He does not talk about the war. He talks about the smell of his mother's grilled sari, about the particular blue of the water outside his village at dawn. You believe he will not survive the first real gunfire. You are wrong about that for a long time. There is also Sergeant Nakamura, 30 years old but carrying himself like a man of 50, already returned once from China and sent back again. He does not shout, he watches. He tells you the men who brag loudest about dying gloriously are usually the ones who beg the loudest when it happens. "Watch the quiet ones," he says, nodding toward Tomo. "That one will surprise you." Months later, a transport ship carries you south, packed so tightly below deck that men sleep sitting up. The air is thick with oil and vomit and the smell of too many bodies in too little room. Somewhere beneath you, American submarines are said to be hunting the convoy. Every change in the engine's pitch stops every conversation at once. Nothing happens this time. That does not make the fear smaller. It only teaches you that fear does not need a reason to stay. You land on an island whose name means nothing to you yet. Coral sand. walls of green jungle, heat that sits on your chest like a hand. The briefing officer unrolls a map and draws arrows through the jungle toward American positions, the same confident lines drawn on every map you will ever see. Tomo leans toward you and whispers that the arrows look very brave for men who have never walked through that jungle. You almost laugh. Nakamura does not. The jungle does not fight like the training grounds. It fights with heat, insects, rot spreading across your feet, inside your boots, silence that breaks apart into gunfire from directions you cannot name. Supply ships stop arriving, rice rations shrink, then nearly vanish. You eat roots you're not certain are safe, and you stop asking Tomo what fish tastes like, because the memory of food has become its own kind of cruelty. Private Sato, 17, lied about his age, the way boys do when they're more afraid of being called a coward than of dying. He carries a photograph of his mother in his helmet lining and talks too often about the medal he'll bring home. 11 days later, an artillery shell takes the trail he's clearing. No medal, no body, only a name added to a list too long for anyone to read aloud anymore. The fighting becomes a rhythm. Move at night, dig before dawn, listen for the cough of mortars before the whistle starts. You stop flinching at your own gun. You never stop flinching at silence, because silence is what comes before the worst of it. One night your patrol reaches a village the Americans are said to be using as a supply point. A shot cracks from a window and your lieutenant falls. Everyone fires at once. When it's over, there are no soldiers inside, only a family who'd stayed behind, and an old man in the doorway with his hands raised, too late to matter. Nobody agrees on where the first shot came from. Nobody asks again. That's the second lesson the jungle teaches you. Some questions do not survive being spoken aloud. Tomo stops talking about fish after that night. He still touches his sister's comb before every advance. Not memory anymore, just proof his hand still belongs to him. Nakamura is killed clearing a ridge you were ordered to take twice, the second time by an officer who knew it would fail and gave the order anyway. Dying, he presses a folded scrap of paper into Tomo's hand. 2 characters. Ikiro, live. Then tells you both to move and says nothing else. You take the ridge. Nobody calls it a victory. Nakamura is never recovered. By the next year, supply ships have nearly stopped. Malaria takes as many men as bullets. Some men in your unit are sent on missions from which no return is planned. You are not chosen. You never learn why. Tomo is wounded in the final weeks, a bullet through the shoulder. You carry him 2 miles through jungle so thick you can't see your own boots. His blood soaking your shirt. His voice asking whether the water back home is still that particular blue. You tell him it is. You have no way of knowing anymore. You tell him anyway. In August, word reaches your unit that the Emperor has spoken on the radio. The fighting is to stop. Some men weep. Some walk into the jungle and don't return. You feel none of the relief you expected, only the sudden, unfamiliar weight of a future you'd stopped letting yourself imagine. You return to Japan that winter on a crowded, silent troop ship. Your mother doesn't recognize you at the gate for one terrible second before she does. Aiko is there, exactly as you remember and entirely different. She asks about the paper crane. You still have it, folded inside your cap the whole way home. You don't tell her about the village, or Sato's helmet, or Nakamura's 2 characters. You tell her the water was very blue in some places. That's not a lie. It's simply not the whole truth. At the paddy, your father is rebuilding the roof you never got to finish. Its sameness should feel like relief. Instead, it feels like an accusation. Proof the world continued exactly as planned while you were somewhere it couldn't follow. You marry Aiko in the spring. Tomo survives, returns to Shikoku, marries, And every New Year sends a package of dried fish with no note attached. None is needed. You keep the crane in a drawer you rarely open. And the senninbari your mother sewed, though you never tell her it didn't stop a single bullet. Your children grow up knowing you served and came home. They don't know that when the shooting stopped, there was no relief, only the strange, unbearable task of learning to be an ordinary man again. At 70, you return to the island with your son. The jungle has grown back over Nakamura's ridge. A memorial stone stands where you're almost certain the village used to be. You take out the paper crane, gray and soft with age, and Nakamura's 2 characters, copied onto a fresh scrap when the original wore through. Ikiro. Live. For the first time you understand the order was never only about that ridge. It was about everything after. The roof, the paddy, the children, the ordinary, unbearable weight of continuing. You fold the crane smaller and leave it at the base of the stone. Then you take your son's arm and walk back down toward the water, which moves exactly as it did that morning 50 years ago. Except nothing is pushing you forward anymore. This time, you choose the direction.